And welcome everyone to the Nuclear Taskforce sessions. Last month was a sellout success, and the recording has gone on to be on the AUKUS Forum YouTube channel. We've got a range of speakers engaging for the months ahead, and we're looking forward to all that we can create together. Some great conversations, some terrific follow-up questions over the last few weeks as well. So we certainly encourage you all to get involved. We're happy for you to be involved with the chat today. So if you have any questions throughout the next hour, please use the chat function there, and we'll do our best to get to questions that may arise. But very pleased today to introduce our guest speakers, Lee Wicker from Entex coming in from Adelaide, and we've got Dale Heineken coming in from Melbourne today. So very pleased for you to both join us, and we've just had some brief catch-ups leading up to this. Can I acknowledge country and recognise elders past, present and emerging. Today I'm coming to you from Canberra, where I was able to catch up with our co-chair, the Honourable Joel Fitzgibbon, yesterday, and we had a great catch-up there. He's just returned from the UK with some terrific conversations around all things AUKUS. So sticking with the nuclear theme today, I think Lee, will start with you, but tell us a bit more about Entex, because the work you're doing with universities, really getting industry on the front foot and making commercial outcomes is a key driver. And I want to talk to you more about nuclear batteries. That's what we've put in the event, right? Because we've put both yours and Dale's bios there. So we'll just get hit the ground running. But tell us a bit more about Entex in the first instance, mate.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, fantastic to be online today and be part of this discussion. We think it's a really important discussion to have and get industry up to speed with all the issues around AUKUS. But to give you a bit of an overview of Entex, we're a technology development company really focusing on generation of energy across a number of different sectors. So effectively, we've got a world-class team of scientists, and we're really sort of specialising in tomorrow's energy technologies. What we try and do is identify different problems affecting or around global energy, decarbonisation, and other sort of pressing issues in the world, and focus some of our technology development around that. So what we're trying to do as a small company is move fast and create value to our shareholders. We've got a relatively flat management structure. We've got people from uranium mining, government organisations within nuclear, oil and gas, and automotive research and development. And we've got 4 distinct areas of focus. We've got a clean energy focus, what we call a pillar, which is looking at green hydrogen. We've got carbon transition technologies, and we've also got medical isotopes, and more pertinent to this discussion is space and defence. Within that space and defence pillar, we're focusing on 2 technologies, and what we do well is pull together development teams from academia and industry partners, and quite often progress these technologies within things like a cooperative centre research project. So we've got 2 technologies that we're developing at the moment, and it's really around harnessing waste radioactive material from the nuclear reactor sector, from mining waste and other underutilised materials, quite often coming out of rare earth extraction. Our power generation technology. Sorry, did I miss something? Our power generation technology is called GenX, and that is effectively, when you think of a solar panel where we're taking photons from the sun, exciting a semiconductor structure and producing electrons or generating electrons. What we're doing is replacing that photon source with a radioactive material layer within that structure. So it's internalising that energy source and effectively pulling that together with a battery manufacturing, I guess, philosophy.
And then that's the stuff, isn't it? I mean, the fact that we've heard the Prime Minister over and over call this the largest industrial project in our nation's history, a whole of nation effort, as he says.
Yep.
That really means that you need, and I know that you're working with several universities around the country, and if you
Yeah.
that with industry, it's a key driver.
Yeah. So just on that point, exactly, I alluded to before around our partnerships. I mean, with this GenX technology, we've got a cooperative research centre project underway, which is a $6.2 million project. We brought in 3 universities in South Australia and West Australia, and some industry partners to develop that. So we'll have a prototype there already in probably the end of this year. We've also got a rapid prototyping contract with a Commonwealth client, which we're doing something similar along the lines of that.
So you're touching on a few things there, Lee, because when we talk about space industry, the Australian Space Agency is still relatively new, and headquartered out of Adelaide, which is close to you guys. As a nation, Australia is a signatory to the NASA Moon to Mars mission. So that's one thing, to be working in space and developing a battery that potentially can work on the moon. Maybe you might want to touch a bit on that, because it's a pretty nasty environment on the moon. If you get energy working there, it's got to be a good thing. But secondly, everyone talks about nuclear waste being a problem, whereas you are actually coming up with solutions to use waste in an efficient way that can actually generate an income.
Yeah, 100%. So I guess with that sort of waste recovery and repurposing materials in that sense, it's not only just the space and defence stuff we're doing, we're also progressing some medical isotope supply chain stuff. So some of that targeted output therapy, radiopharmaceuticals, if you looked at back down the supply chain, that quite often comes from tailings waste or isotopes you recover from oil and gas, scale from transmission and process infrastructure. So we're using our expertise in those areas and our networks to be able to form sort of end-to-end supply chains for not only the space and defence stuff, but in medicine.
So what does it mean as far as getting people for a company like Entex? We're talking about 20,000 trained nuclear people we need in Australia as part of the AUKUS project. You heard me say last time we need 70,000 new welders to get involved. So where are we going to find all these people? It seems to me if we're going to build submarines, we're going to need welders. But Weld Australia put out their report saying we'll need 70,000 welders over the coming years. So there's a lot of skills uplift needed, and I have no doubt that you guys must be looking into all that.
Yeah, so in terms of, I guess, getting skills and capability in personnel, we're quite lucky that our management team have an in-depth knowledge, experience in nuclear sectors and the resource sector. But what we need to do, we can't really, I guess in a sense, we can't recruit the exact positions we want. So that's where we bring students out of universities, and whether or not they're attached to these projects, but we also bring graduates on that might be doing masters or a PhD. So we're having to, I guess, develop those capabilities within house and bringing students in. We also have a number of work experience students coming out of year 10 and year 11 working with us at the moment as well. So we'll probably have 4 of those in the last 12 months. And for a company that's got 23 people, that's a pretty big commitment to, developing future human resources in the space.
Absolutely. And, Lee and Dale, we've got quite a range of people have joined us today. So we've got a range of country mayors. We've got Jamie Chaffey, who's the Mayor of Gunnedah, here with us in his capacity as the President of the Country Mayors Association. And we can't be just focused on our capital cities. AUKUS, as a whole of nation effort, has to include our regional areas too. So we're really grateful that you could all join us here today. Feel free to add any questions in the chat if you'd like to, and we'll get to them as we can. We've also got people from the UK, and we've got former Navy commanders joining us from the US as well. So good to have you all here joining us. But the conversation is vast. And Dale, I might throw to you around the skills uplift and industry, because we know we've got a manufacturer here from regional Tasmania joining us as well. It was great to visit Tasmania last month and do a series of workshops across the state. And Dale, you were able to join us in Hobart. But if we start talking about industry and nuclear, it's much more than just the nuclear science. We do need all our plumbers and electricians and all the infrastructure that goes with it. Did you want to touch a bit on that?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Appreciate the opportunity to speak here with this group. It's quite a diverse and impressive group of individuals. So hopefully we'll be able to touch base, or at least touch on a topic that everybody's interested in at some point in the conversation. But you mentioned this as a whole of nation effort, and it's really a whole of three nation, well, not really a whole of nation for Australia, but with significant support from the UK and the US. And I think when we talk about that is that when you talk about a submarine, there's a secondary and a primary side of that. The secondary side is just like anything else. It's like a normal steam plant. There's a lot type 1 steam valves required, piping associated with it. And then there's the primary side, which is the part that we tend to focus on. That's the really hot rock, the nuclear side of it, where there's very stringent controls and a lot of training and knowledge needs to go into that side. But there's, I share that because I think there's an aspect that everybody can participate in the building of a nuclear submarine in Australia, as well as supporting their maintenance, is because there's not just the nuclear side. There's all the other parts and components that come with a submarine and operating it. Let's focus a little bit on the nuclear side. Our PANZA right now is the regulator for really all nuclear activity in Australia by legislation. There is legislation coming out that's standing up the Australian Nuclear Powered Submarine Safety Regulator. It's still draft legislation right now, and if anybody hasn't looked at it yet, it is worth reading, so you can start mentally preparing for that. Still going through Parliament to get approved on that. Some of the things I'll say is a caveat that it might be likely to change because they are soliciting industry feedback, and somebody that was involved in some of the industry feedback sessions said it's good. They were happy that they're actually listening. The committee's actually listening to them on what needs a change in it. So there could be some changes, but when you look at the regulations, or I'm sorry, the legislation, it's a big document, but about 80% of that is what happens if you do something wrong or you violate a nuclear safety type thing. When you look at what is required to be a license holder, it's very specific. A license holder is anybody that's doing an activity within a designated area. Currently, right now, that's Stirling and Osborne. So in Adelaide and Perth, somebody doing a nuclear activity within there is going to be a license holder. And it really has only one requirement, that they have a nuclear safety management system. And so now's the time to start, because if you ask people, and somebody came to me and goes, what's a nuclear safety management system? I'm like, well, think about it like ISO 9001 or AS 9100, one of those ISO standards. But it's more, it's plus. As we were talking with Roger prior to the meeting beginning, when you start talking about nuclear power, nuclear energy, you've got to have a quality management system that is very robust. And, when I was serving in the US Navy, we'd talk about every valve in there. It was tracked from the time it's mined out of the ground to it's installed in that ship and then is ultimately disposed of. That's the level of quality we're talking about when we're talking about nuclear components, is that from where it's basically its origin all the way to its final destination. And that's a lot of record keeping, a lot of administration, a lot of overhead that goes with it. And that's probably one of the key parts about that nuclear safety management system. But now's the time for people to start thinking about what it means to have a nuclear safety management system. Again, it's kind of like ISO 9001, except now you got to focus on the nuclear aspect, how you can protect the environment with your activities, how are you going to protect people's safety, their health, how are you going to monitor that, what kind of people will you add to your organization to manage that for you, and then with a very strong emphasis on continuous improvement and the quality management side. So that's kind of how things are shaping up. The regulations still have not been drafted as going to define it, but I think if you start thinking about that, how you can plug into that organization and start thinking about what is a nuclear safety management system, that will help companies start preparing for when it does get released and get published for people to join into. So I think there's opportunity here. Now it's the time to start thinking about that cultural aspect as well as that requirements for that going forward.
And Dale, you're coming from a background of 20 plus years in naval nuclear propulsion. You've been a reactor officer. You've captained several US Navy ships. So you're certainly speaking from experience. But based on that, you look at places like Huntington Ingalls Industries, the workforce that's around that community is huge. And it is your electricians and your plumbers and the like. So having the country mayors on here, if you're talking about regional opportunities, it is all your welding and it is all the components and everything else, much more than just the nuclear science.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's something that's published about maybe a year ago. I think they looked at the workforce requirements, and it was only the top 1% that were the nuclear engineers. That the other 90% was all your trades and people that are smart with working in a limited radiation environment and being able to manage it. But there's a lot of it is your traders, ship fitters, riggers. These were some of the people that were the hardest to get onto a ship to get maintenance done was your riggers, because they have to be trained and skilled and ability to work in confined spaces. Ship fitters, the welders, the boiler makers and stuff that come in and do that. Very little what required somebody that was, through and through a nuclear engineer or nuclear scientist. Most of it was just the trades of how do you maintain and build these ships, and that's a lot of industry support to go into. So it's not the fancy or sexy things that we'd like to think about. Everybody's investing very heavily into getting a bunch of nuclear engineers, but it really is about getting that skill set in your base workforce group built up that can understand what nuclear is and support the building of the submarines as well as the infrastructure required to go with it.
Yeah, and that's Charlie Ilbeck, who hosted us for our Christmas event, the factory floor in Western Sydney. Ilbeck Cranes have a large workforce, over 300 people making all the overhead gantry cranes that we find in most factories across Australia. And Charlie said to me, he said, Sharpie, if they're going to make submarines, they're going to need cranes. So count me in with AUKUS. And I think that's a key example. But Chris Skinner is joining us today too. And Chris has put a note there in the chat around the 20,000 skilled workers that have been published that we're going to need. They don't all need to have a nuclear engineering degree, which is noted there. And as Chris is saying there, have a look at the Defence Industry Development Strategy. And Chris, you've even been kind enough to put it there, page 67. So this is great. But I think that gives the example around the broad opportunity that we're developing. And as I often say, AUKUS is not a 3-year project. What we're doing today is really setting the foundation for the decades ahead. And so we need to get everyone on board, because it's not just a whole of nation effort. As I've heard the Prime Minister say, it's also equals a whole of nation opportunity. So this is a good thing. And on that, Dale, I want to touch on this new grouping coming together globally around cargo ships. So we've seen in the news over the last month that 4 of the major shipping companies have come together to look investigate what it means to have nuclear propulsion on their cargo ships. That would be a change in circumstances. What do you think that would look like?
Oh, I think that would be a huge change. It makes sense in a way. It's a zero carbon energy source. You can put it on there. It has long lifespan. Depending on the size of the reactor, you can get 20 to 30 years out of it. I'm hesitant to celebrate that one too much, just because being in the Navy and my experience with the Merchant Marine, it's typically companies will buy a ship and do very little maintenance on it. Basically, they're trying to squeeze every penny or dollar out of that upfront cost of buying a ship and make sure they get a good return on it. So maintenance and training is a little bit on the lower end, and I'm not trying to insult anybody that's in that industry, and happy to be proven wrong. That's just my archetype or stereotype as I've interacted with the Merchant Marine. Is it's very much you have people come in, they do a stint, and then they roll off and do something different. And when you're talking about nuclear power, you're talking about a huge, significant investment in the culture. And we're talking about continuous improvement. How do you take small issues? It could be as simple as somebody didn't bring the right tool for a maintenance item. You pull it back, you evaluate it. Why did we not have the right tool available to do that maintenance item? And then you put either a process in place or training in place that makes sure they have the right tool the next time they do that maintenance. Pulling out the Leatherman from your back pocket and opening a valve or tightening a nut is not the right solution. So changing that behavior so that it's ingrained into the Merchant Marine force is going to be huge. And then, particularly in the U.S. nuclear propulsion program, which I'm most experienced is they never leave redundancy on the piers. Was the phrase was always said, is like either the plant operates 100% or not at all. It would require very exceptional, almost time of significant conflict that you would get a ship underway and all systems were not operating at 100%. So you have this very high standard of if a certain valve is not operating 100%, you replace it or you don't get the vessel underway. I don't know if that culture will translate into a commercial maritime environment, because again, it's about dollars and how do you maximize profit in that case. And again, I'm throwing some very broad statements out there that will potentially offend somebody that's in the Merchant Marine, but that's my viewpoint, is that it require a very significant change in the culture for the Marine, that the Merchant Marine force to have nuclear power as a energy source or propulsion source for their vessels.
And a lot of this talk is coming around because of what they call green miles. And that's coming around, the COP26 and COP28 and all the conversation around environmental concerns. We know that there's talk around the EU around taxation for transport. So shipping companies naturally are looking at what opportunities they have to reduce their emissions. And it seems that nuclear is a hot topic for them right now. But that takes me back to you, Lee. You must be looking at opportunities for exporting the technologies that you guys are making. I know you're making a range of products. You've certainly got a range of research projects underway. Maybe you want to touch on a couple of them, other projects other than the nuclear battery. And what do you see as the opportunity for exporting this Australian technology?
Yeah, so the other, excuse me, technology that we're working on is what they call a radioisotope heating unit. And it's an old NASA design which used to use plutonium. And obviously with anti-proliferation laws, the civil and the commercial space sector can't get their hands on too much plutonium. So we've repurposed a number of different isotopes in concept designs to replace that plutonium. So it's got a very similar heat profile as plutonium does, but obviously shorter half-lives. So that's one thing that, well, probably the other space and defence technology we're developing. When it comes to export, I mentioned before that I attended the export conference in Adelaide recently, and we need to get better at understanding what interacting with ITAR technologies is going to be. Even though we do have, the AUKUS agreement in place, there's still restrictions on who and how and what you can do. So in particular, with one of our technologies is definitely ITAR. But when we're looking at integration or subsystem integration, we will be working with ITAR technology on the other end. So yeah, it's really important that we understand what requirements are of us.
And as far as then, as the company expands and the technologies come more to fruition, and companies like Entex, if I can broaden the conversation there, what would it look like for establishing manufacturing, in regional areas as well? There must be opportunities that you could set up manufacturing facilities, engage local workforces on different projects.
Yeah, 100%. And I guess it's relevant to AUKUS from a waste management side of things, but we're working with a company called TELUS, which has got the only commercial low-level radioactive waste repository in the middle of West Australia. So that's out the back of nowhere. I think it's about 150, 200 k's west-northwest of Kalgoorlie. So they operate a pretty sharp setup out there. So what we're looking to do is repurpose some of that waste for some of our technology developments, more specifically in the medical isotope business, but there are opportunities to recover certain isotopes that can be used in our energy generation technologies.
Well, that's a good thing because certainly, as I said earlier, the waste is often a conversation that comes up, but now we're talking about new technologies that can actually use that waste. This is a breakthrough. And Dale, this is when we had the chief engineer from Rolls-Royce zoomed in. He was talking about the small modular reactors for producing power, energy. But as he said, they've been building for 60 odd years to fit inside the submarines. So when we're talking about technology, it never stands still. And so the new technology we're seeing coming through using, Entex technology for recycling medical waste isotopes to small modular reactors being designed by Rolls-Royce. And we know there's other companies in the US like NuScale Power, and I think Bill Gates is involved with the company as well. So the technology, it never stands still, and who knows what's next, hey?
Yeah, no, in fact, I was just talking to an individual that's leading research at Princeton University yesterday, more in the fusion side, but he mentioned a word, not small modular reactors, but micro modular reactors. So even small, it's almost, as soon as he said it, reminded me of Lee and his battery. Is that what we're talking about with, micro modular reactors? But, going back to our previous conversation about the merchant marine and the green miles and stuff, the small modular reactors, and this is where I think the technology will help out if they can be self-contained units where they don't require a lot of maintenance and expertise. And I think that's still yet to be proven or seen. But where they're really self-contained units, maybe they run off of potential waste, radioactive waste that is now subsequently reutilized into a small modular reactor. So I think there's a lot of realm in there, but you get a system like that onto a merchant ship that doesn't require a lot of maintenance. It's basically a battery type system that runs for a really long time and uses electric propulsion. I think there's something there, but I still have some hesitancy about nuclear power as its current technology supports into merchant ships. But yeah, it's incredible if you look at that, the investment in there, and you can pick up the newspaper only any given day, and there'll be somebody out very pro small modular reactors and somebody very counter small modular reactors, you know, citing the cost of them and everything else. But I think it was time and history has proven you get people interested in it and get capitalism putting cash into the technology. The technology eventually gets there, and it gets to a point where it's actually a very cost competitive, but they need people to invest in it now. And I think what we're seeing in the UK, the US, and the EU is they're starting to invest in that small modular technology. And it's just a matter of time before it becomes really a viable technology. And we might look back on these days where we're still discussing if it's worthwhile or not and going, how do we not see it as worthwhile? Because it's so cheap and it's flexible. You know, you can put them in remote areas and power for decades.
And that with you too, Lee, I mean, the technology to be able to operate a battery on the moon must lend itself to having opportunities in remote mining sites or, you know, remote regional and rural Australia. Is there much work going to working with the Minerals Council or other groups like that around energy for remote sites?
Not so much as a primary power source, because the beta voltaic battery by nature is low level power for decades. That's really the value proposition around that. So when we're looking at how do we optimize power management strategies in a space mission or in a defense, you know, capability scenario, the GenX offers, I guess, another dimension to how we manage, you know, battery payloads and how we manage providing power to a particular capability. Specifically in a mining sense, we've looked at low-level power, and we've, I guess, in concept discussed what are you know, things like rock bolts that go into an underground mine shaft, and how they're developing smart rock bolts now that can detect small micro seismic activities that could be a precursor to some sort of disaster. How our battery could have enabling capabilities in that respect to then maybe transmit data. So having essentially a wireless mine working, and that data transmission. So yeah, we've sort of touched on that in concept, but certainly not a primary power supply for that would replace diesel generation or something like that.
And when we talk about the research side of things, I know you've done quite a bit with ANSTO and others, but in Australia, would it be fair to say our research is limited when we're talking about nuclear industry? And I'm going to things like when we hear organisations like Princeton and other nuclear research activities in the UK and Rolls-Royce and the companies themselves, there seems to be a whole host of research activities happening in the US and the UK that we don't necessarily get access to. I guess potentially through AUKUS and the ITAR and other things that you mentioned, that is an opportunity. But could you give us an insight into how you see research happening here in Australia?
Yeah, so I think there's definitely hot pockets of research. So you look at University of Wollongong, ANU, some of the things that we're doing with the local universities here, even University of Southern Queensland, who we've got a Trailblazer project with at the moment. There are certainly hot pockets and some really, really smart people, experienced people in that research space, but we just need more of them. We feel that the collaboration between the groups is quite good, because I think even though there are hot pockets, I think everyone's got to understand that they've got a vested interest in making this, you know, become a thing, right? So that collaboration piece is there, and that even went to the point where, you know, there's the National Space Qualification Network, and that was headed up by Australian National University, ANSTO, and I think University of Wollongong was in that. And that was specifically around providing space qualification testing for, you know, things like electronic boards where you're going to bombard them with certain types of radiation to prove they'll work in the space environment. So there is some really, really good things happening, but there's not enough of it happening.
And then we're talking about the skills uplift earlier, but nuclear is so much more than just, you know, producing the energy for whatever project. There's all sorts of things around cybersecurity that must be important. Do you touch on much of that? And can you give us some insights into advanced cyber security that you see coming down the line?
Well, we're members of the Defence Industry Security Program, so DISP. So we have to have a level of security through our organisation that will support our EV1 clearance personnel. So getting back to, I guess, the capabilities in cyber security and how that affects us, not necessarily, we'll probably go out to third parties for that support, but in terms of having a posture around security posture around cyber, we've already got that in place through the DISP program.
Yep. It'll only expand, and the skills and capabilities we need are broad, as Chris Skinner said earlier in that chat, much more than just nuclear itself. We need a whole host of activity. And as we talked with Roger before, think about the car parks and the infrastructure that go with it. So there certainly is a whole host of opportunity coming down the line for decades to come. And Dale, when I'm talking about research, you mentioned Princeton, but there's many others, and the companies themselves, like NewScale, were the first company, as I understand it, to get regulation approval. And so there must be a lot of work going on into just getting the regulations right in the first instance for these companies to gain those approvals. So maybe you want to touch a bit more on around the infrastructure required, but the paperwork and the body of work around regulation approvals that we're going to see.
Yeah, I think from the Australia perspective, it's still a work in progress as people figure out what it looks like for Australia, taking advisement from the UK and the US as well. But I think everybody's all in agreement. I have yet to see anybody counter this one, is that whatever gets developed, it's going to be a uniquely Australian regulations and licensing, obviously gathering lessons learned and best practices from our partner nations in this endeavor. But the regulations will drive what's it look like to do that. And I think it feeds into that research piece. As I thought about your question to Lee, we don't have a lot of nuclear research in Australia compared to the other countries, because and it goes back to, again, I hate to keep referring to our previous conversation before we actually started this conversation, but Roger Noble brought up the social license aspect, and that it's a whole of community involvement. And he mentioned the dry dock up in Scotland and how, everybody in the town supports it. Safety is foremost. Quality, they get it, they understand it. And it's kind of like that with research as well. If the government's not supporting nuclear, which up until AUKUS it wasn't supporting, you're not going to have a lot of researchers want to invest into the nuclear side of it. They're going to invest heavily into the medical side, which we see, I'd say Australia is leading in the medical research. But we see countries like the US that are going to invest very heavily into nuclear, as well as the European Union. So the regulations, right now, based upon what I'm seeing is developing in Australia, they should be relatively straightforward. Obviously, nothing is ever straightforward when it comes to the government and regulations. But I think there's going to be that aspect of the regulations got to get published, at being informed, or they need to be developed, informed by industry and the experts, and then get the regulations out there so that people can start planning to that. And I think it goes back to a lot of the questions probably right here. It's what's it look like in the future? What do I do, and how do I get plugged in? And a lot of it's going to depend on the legislation and regulations that come out. And now is the time that's being formulated. But start thinking about, based upon the drafts that are out there, is what do you need to do as an organization to be prepared for those regulations? And there may be some subtle changes, but I would tell you the bulk of what you need to do now. And again, I would reference that nuclear safety management system, getting that stood up. And that's not something you're going to probably do in 6 months, unless you already have nuclear expertise in your company. That's an endeavor, because, and for some companies, it'll be an easy lift because you've already got top-notch quality programs in place, and a lot of them are just business best practices. But for others, it's going to be a heavy lift and a complete change in hiring and training them and the right kind of people to bring in that culture to the organization.
And Chris Skinner's dropped another note here. Thanks, Chris. Around the UNSW have just launched their Nuclear Innovation Centre and collaborating with MIT. So I think we're going to see a lot more of that type of activity, no doubt, because we're starting from, I guess, fair to say, we're starting from a very low base. But also, I think this is where the councils in particular have a role to play. And I was just in Dubbo day before yesterday holding an AUKUS workshop in the main street there with council hosted us there. We had a full house of a whole range of local industry wanting to understand the opportunities through AUKUS. So more than just nuclear, but we're talking things like robotics, welding and automation in manufacturing. We talk about food production. We had companies there talking about space. But I think there's an opportunity, Dale. I think if we were to bring you to Dubbo, and I think we'd fill the room again just to talk around nuclear. And I think this is a role that councillors can play all over the country. That if we come to these regions and have the conversation in person, and then the ability to walk the factory floors, that seems to really bring people along that conversation. And I know you're in Melbourne and Lee's in Adelaide, but these days to be able to bring people along the conversation, I think will change. And companies like I know we've got people here from Tasmania on the Zoom today in regional Tasmania for welding and other fabrication activities. There's no shortage of people who want to get involved. And I think that's going to be the key driver moving forward. I know our conversations with the people out of the universities, another one is the University of Connecticut. So UConn are based right at where they manufacture the submarines. And so naturally there's a big fabrication workforce around that university. So the more we can get researchers involved, what I've seen, what I've experienced is that those companies who get involved across manufacturing, if they look at defence or space too as an opportunity, it has a way of lifting that whole company. It becomes exciting or interesting for the workforce. They learn new skills. The quality improves for those companies, and it seems to me that they gain more customers because of those reasons. So we've got Ivan here from UTS Tech Lab, and Ivan, you joined us in Dubbo, so I've certainly got some great feedback from your presentation. But you see here in the chat that Ivan's saying that the chief scientist led an effort back then around working and studying with the US and the UK. So there's certainly a lot of opportunities that have been tried before. I think there's a concerted effort now, and for obvious reasons that there's a lot more effort going into it this time. So certainly our monthly speaker series at UTS Tech Lab is where we bring a range of people together. But then Ivan, really grateful again that you could join us out in Dubbo. And as I said, we've just done workshops across Tasmania, and I've just returned last week from regional Queensland. So there's going to be a lot more travel, and we certainly encourage you all to get involved, and feel free to reach out if you'd like us to come and talk with you. But Dale, across the United States, I was having a conversation with that fellow out of San Diego around fusion technology. And as he said, the United States is so much larger. Australia's the same size continent, if you like, geographic size, but 25, 28 million people compared to 350 million people. It's a different beast.
Yeah, it's different, and particularly when you look at the workforce base, but just even manning from the defense side of manning these personnel. Even in the US with 350 million people, the Navy has to give bonuses to nuclear qualified individuals to keep them in. Okay. So because, well, first of all, they've got a really unique skill set. They're usually recruited from the top, let's say top 10% of the defense force, and then they're sent through some pretty rigorous training. They're imbued with certain cultural attributes, and so they're very much in demand. But it's also a very hard lifestyle. I don't think we should, broad brush, but working in the nuclear industry is tough because of the scrutiny you get, because of the consequences that happen if something goes wrong. So that quality management system, the continuous improvement stuff can be very hard. So they offer a lot of money to nuclear trained qualified people to stay within defense. If that's the discussion we're going to start having here, is if you already got a small population base and now you want to take that top 10% who everybody else is competing for, and then put them into a submarine and then put them for a very rigorous lifestyle for when they are underway. Are you willing to give them the money that's going to keep them incentivized? Because they can take that skill set if you train them up and transition to a construction company, to a consultancy, to pretty much anything, because they get these inherent or innate capabilities that are ingrained into them through all that training and indoctrination into the program. So yeah, the population definitely makes it easier, but it's still a challenge even for a large population to man a nuclear submarine force.
And maybe even just on a bit of that, Dale, your experience around the Navy and the US Navy and the various ships that you've captained, to have a workforce on board, and now, this talk around Australia, and I know, Chris, I'm sure you have comments around this, but to have a workforce on board a diesel submarine must be different to a nuclear submarine that can stay away for so much longer. What does that look for, as far as attracting sailors that want to be part of a nuclear submarine and potentially being extended away for an extended time?
Yeah, it might be a better question to ask Matt Stewart, but I did my submarine cruise when I was trying to decide if I wanted to go on a surface ship or a submarine, and I decided submarine life was not for me. It's not Hunt for Red October. It's not any of the movies that make it seem very fun and exciting. So it was not my cup of tea. So I think it's a special breed that wants to go underway under the ocean and not see the sun for 3 months at a time, if not longer there. But yeah, I think it's a unique person, but again, it's something that it appeals to certain people, that excitement and going off and doing stuff, and the missions that you have operating on submarines that can operate for a long time undersea is it's pretty exciting stuff. Unfortunately, they can never talk about it. If you've ever been in a conversation with two submariners, they're like, when I was here, yeah, I know, yeah, and they have a conversation without actually talking about anything because it's all classified, but it's really exciting stuff that appeals to certain individuals that want to do that. It wasn't my cup of tea, so I went nuclear surface and spent my time because I found out I valued sunlight every 3 days.
We had a great conversation with a family who came along to the workshop in Dubbo, and their two sons joined us. They've decided to join the defence here in Australia. The younger brother's joining the Air Force, and he's got an interest in getting involved with drone technology and hopeful to become a pilot for the F-35s. He's looking at learning the Japanese language because the Japanese also have the F-35 fleet, so there's an opportunity there. And his brother is entering the Navy around that. So they're a very proud family. Certainly the boys were getting themselves fit, ready for their introduction into being involved with defence. But they're quite excited. So it was great talking with them. And Lee, I wanted to touch on around access to capital. And Dale, you might have some comments around this too, around your business and other activities. But as far as access to capital, Lee, we know there's talk of something like $400 billion out of VC firms in the US looking for a home. I'm sure you'd be willing to take a part in some of that, but VC is never easy. Tell us a bit around accessing capital and the growth of business here in Australia in general, and maybe some insights around what Entex are doing.
I guess to give the Entex story first up, we've raised capital a couple of times. So I guess what fuels our machine is really we've raised capital. We draw upon our existing shareholder base. So we'll do a cap raise. We might do rights issues as well. We also rely heavily on grant funding, and we've been quite fortunate to be able to put together some good applications that have been successful. And more recently, we've got our first contract for a rapid prototyping. So what we see difficult is when you're looking at the technology readiness scale, it's quite often easier to get TRL to TRL1 to TRL3 funded. And there's essentially a bit of a valley of death between then and when the later stage TRL, sort of 7, 8, 9, when you get to commercialization. So yeah, that middle of the journey is quite hard to fund. Some of the VCs want to get in earlier, and what the ones that want to get in later want to, say your business is worth 10% of what you think it is. So it is a bit of a dance when you're trying to raise capital. But yeah, there's no shortage out there. I think that's probably more active in Europe and the States than it is in Australia. We tend to be, and in particular in South Australia, we tend to be a little bit more conservative from what we invest in traditionally. But yeah, certainly we're looking at opportunities beyond South Australia for raising capital.
Yeah, and it strikes me that we're seeing more news stories around US firms acquiring Australian companies. I think we might see more of that. Potentially, it'd be great to see more investment into Australia, and we build that capability here. It'll be interesting to see how that develops over the coming years. But around that capital involvement, I'm sure we'll see more from the UK flowing here as well, because we're seeing companies, the large companies like Babcock and the like, establishing infrastructure, building workforce, not just in Adelaide, but across the country. So I'm sure we'll see more firms setting up branches in Australia, if you like. But I think that's the opportunity, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think if we look back to some of the previous defence projects, I spent probably 15 years in oil and gas, and then came back to Adelaide in 2015, just right at the time where it was, really starting to ramp up, and there was a lot of industry engagement, industry forums and that. And I guess the message was to skill up, to invest, and really sort of create an industry. I think a lot of that political spin was there was a bit of, not so much misinformation, but I think the timelines were quite ambitious, and consequently, when we saw the attack class, the Naval Group project be cancelled, there were a lot of people and a couple of businesses in South Australia, particularly, that went under. That probably, I guess, put a lot of effort into that particular program. And yeah, there's a few people in South Australia in particular that are quite burnt from in investing too early. So I think really understanding what the timeframes are, when the decisions are going to be made, and investing at the right times. I think that's really important for local companies. And I guess the international companies like Babcock will be aware of those timelines as well. So it's really sort of having the right conversations at the right time and really understanding when investment needs to happen.
Absolutely. And Dale, this is the sort of thing where we see US firms wanting to invest in Australia. Some of the conversations I've had with industry leaders here in this country is that we have the ability now through AUKUS to lift all boats. So using new technologies potentially developed in our universities, but then finding commercial partners in the US who can do the research and add on to the opportunity, and it becomes a much broader opportunity. I think we'll see more of that, don't you?
Yeah, I agree. If you look at, the Australia, and we talked a little bit about the population earlier, it's significantly smaller than the US, but there's a lot of capability and a lot of very niche companies here that are doing some really incredible stuff. And the challenge is that you don't have that big population base to fund a lot of that development, if that makes sense. So you become very reliant on the government to provide either contracts or grant money, as Lee kind of mentioned as well, to fund it. So when you get these companies that are incredibly attractive, they're relatively small size. If you're a US company, you got money, you're going to come in and be like, I got a capability here that's in Australia. I can buy that and acquire that and add it to my portfolio. So it's very enticing. Like, it makes sense. I think more people will now start looking at what is available in Australia. And I think they've been doing that for a while. One of the companies I work for is owned by a US corporation, a $6.3 billion company, kind of thing. And so it makes it good. They buy these unique capabilities, and then they can open it up to the US market and vice versa. So I think we will see that. And I think we also, venture capital is two different things in Australia than it is in the US. And I have not taken advantage of venture capital funding, but I've been about one step removed and in circles and looking at how that goes. One person kind of summed it up very well: is venture capitalism in the US, they kind of just throw money at a problem. And it was an Australian that was in the US was talking, like, I was at a meeting and I was telling him I needed to raise $5 million. The person got on the phone during the meeting. The next thing he said, where do you want us to put the $5 million? Compared to that, to their experience in Australia as well, how can you guarantee my $5 million? What are you going to do? When's my return? And this risk aversion that exists. So I think we talk very differently, where the US is more proclivity towards putting money into research and investment, particularly if it's already kind of a mature technology. It's kind of an easy win versus Australia venture capitalism. So a little bit of a roundabout way of kind of answering your question, but giving some different perspectives on, yes, I do continue to see more US companies investing in Australia.
Yeah, for sure. And so why don't we take the opportunity, if there's any questions, so please, for all of you, feel free to drop a question in the chat, and we've got 10 more minutes to go. So happy for some questions that may come through, and we'll try to get to them. But it seems to me, based on this conversation, back to regional Australia, I see as a really enormous opportunity. And on our website, the AUKUSforum.com, you'll see our AUKUS Connect program. We've got colleagues joining us today from the US around our AUKUS Connect program. But you'll see a case study on the AUKUS Connect page for Vessi Water, which are based out of Tamworth. This is a startup company that are developing water technology from the University of New South Wales. They capture water from air, which would be quite convenient, you would think, in remote locations and defence applications. So they're raising capital at the moment in regional Australia, being at Tamworth. but they're also looking for opportunities to export that technology from Tamworth to the rest of the world. And it makes sense around the AUKUS opportunity that naturally they're talking with us around companies in the US and support for looking to establish manufacturing in further afield. So these are the opportunities coming down the line. But Lee, I think we'll see more of that opportunity around companies that are looking for capital, looking for how they can expand into the US and the UK. And I guess these conversations are going to be where we bear fruit.
Yeah, I think so. And I think we've pretty much touched on most of the main points around capital. And there's probably not much I could add to that.
But as far as the technology you guys are developing and the jobs you're creating, you can have people all over the place in the US and the UK adding in their insights with the technology like we've got today with Zoom. I often say, and it's unusual for me today to be sitting at the desk. Normally I use the car as the mobile Zoom studio, but the ability or the capability now through what AUKUS is offering for you to have an opportunity to engage with US firms or UK firms is probably going to be a game changer.
Yeah, 100%. I guess we've already started looking at what does a move to or an expansion to the US look like, because when we're talking about supply chains end to end, from where do we get our radioactive waste material or underutilized resources, the US is obviously a logical source of that material, and having that supply chain in the same country as your manufacturing and potentially as your customers entirely makes sense.
Yeah, and Chris Skinner's just asked a question there around the information, and it's a fair question too, Chris, because a lot of people are asking what's going on with AUKUS, and I guess necessarily there's a lot of things we don't hear about, but we're certainly engaging with groups like the AI group. I featured on one of their podcasts around manufacturing in particular, but we're also, as the AUKUS Forum, reaching out to similar groups in the US and the UK and having some great Zoom discussions, which will have some very exciting news for you in the near future. But we need to have that broader conversation, and we need to talk to colleagues in the US and the UK. And who knows what's coming down the line, because at the start of this year, we were talking about New Zealand. And so all the media and all the conversation was around New Zealand coming into AUKUS. And then it seemed out of the blue that the media started reporting that Japan may join, and then we'd have JAWKUS. But quickly, only a week later, it was about South Korea as well. So I don't think any of us really know where this might end up, which is why I think we need to just have these conversations and these community workshops we've been holding, because that's where the rubber hits the road. We're actually seeing those case studies, as I mentioned, like Vessi Water out of regional Australia, really grabbing that opportunity and saying, how can we really engage now? And I think we'll see more of that, Dale, because that's where, obviously industry has its own demand across a range of activities. But the more that we can connect people, because at the end of the day, it's always going to come down to people, don't you think? And so Lynn is here saying about, it's a good point, Lynn. So Lynn Wood, and Lynn, thank you for your contribution over many years with Idea Spies and skilling workforce. And I know there's work going on now with school projects. And Lynn says, what about connecting with design and tech students in schools? It's a very good point. And Lee, I'm sure you've got some insights into that around the universities, but I think TAFE has a role to play as well. When we think about students coming in, we want to make it attractive. These days, I think, people talk about the need for 70,000 welders. I don't know where we're going to find them, but pretty much if you can operate a PlayStation today, you could operate a robotics welding machine. So how do we make it more interesting for the kids coming through?
Well, having said that, I've got a son that wants to get into robotics, but he's talking about animatronics and that type of thing. And I said, what about space and defense and all the cool things you can do there? He's like, oh, no, it's too hard. I'm more interested in this type of cool stuff you see on YouTube and whatnot. But seriously, as I said before, we do engage students back at high school who are interested in engineering and chemistry. We do work with students through masters and PhD programs. But I guess that's not really solving the issue in the short term and midterm around having those sort of 15 to 20 year experience people coming from oil and gas. The only way that we could develop those big LNG projects is to bring people in from Europe, from Norway to Scotland, the US, that had this experience and were able to help use that expertise to develop these projects, and that was the only way it could actually happen. And that was a massive requirement for skilled and experienced people in that industry. I think we can do the same in this industry, but we've obviously got, you know, the security clearance issues, the ITAR issues. I know there's a bit of talk around how we work within AUKUS and the visa waiver program. I said a couple of weeks ago that, you know, we noticed in, say, 2022, the Rolls-Royce, the Nuclear Skills Academy they've got over in the UK, they had 1,200 people apply for 200 apprenticeship roles across technical and operational disciplines. So there's 1,000 people looking for opportunities in the UK. So I know that the recent budget has committed $107 million, I think, over the next 7 years to a skills academy here. But that's not necessarily going to solve the issue of having those, you know, 15 to 20 year experienced people come in when we start operating, you know, rotational force west and those sort of things. So yeah, that's something we need to look at. And it's all good and well to say, let's develop the next generation of nuclear skills and workers required in this project. But, you know, that's not really looking at or addressing the short-term issues that we've got.
And it's across the board because AUKUS is such a broad opportunity. It's so much more than just nuclear submarines. Claire Larkin-Sykes is joining us. She was on the last Zoom session talking about critical minerals, and we're fully engaged with Broken Hill, and I'm sure the Mayor of Broken Hill is joining us today as well. One of our members there, FabTech, are doing some fabulous work in the mining sector. But as the Prime Minister said, we want to make stuff here in Australia. So critical minerals, why do we just dig it up out of the ground and ship it off? Let's make things here. So I think we'll see more of that. I certainly believe the opportunity is engaging with people in the US and the UK around technologies, which could be just for mining technologies. Think about all that new equipment coming through that we could use and potentially do mining in more efficient ways. Rail infrastructure will play a key part, which means that the local communities have to play a part as well. So this will become a national conversation. I'm really glad that Lee and Dale, you could join us here today. I'm sure you're happy to take questions offline. So if any of you would like to send emails through to Kathy at the AUKUS Forum, Kathy at AUKUSforum.com. Thanks, Kathy, for arranging all this today. But we certainly look forward to putting this up on the YouTube and taking your questions or feedback around what more we can do to engage with you all across the country. And thank you to those joining us from the US and the UK at different time zones. The next one in 4 weeks' time will be more around nuclear fusion, and we will have people talking about community engagement here in Australia, but technology from the US and the UK and what that can mean to build partnerships across the 3 AUKUS nations. So can I thank everyone for joining us today, and we'll see you all in a month's time. All the best.